Sleigh 54, Benjamin Armstrong. 47, 48, 49, 50. Jack counted as each sleigh, led by 8 flying reindeer, lifted into the starless sky on their way to the outer world, the human one. Jack quickly looked back down at the beasts in front of him and made sure the crupper was on properly for the 5th time that day. Each sleigh held 5 elven soldiers. Close to Jack's right stood Ross, the sleigh leader, who itched his evenly trimmed beard. Behind Ross sat the navigator, Ronald, studying notes and maps that crinkled beneath his fingers. He had joined Sleigh 54 a year before Jack. On the left and right side of the sleigh stood the 2 young lads, Kevin and Jeremy, who both eagerly gripped their crossbows. 51, 3 left, 2 left. Jack watched as the 53rd sled and its reindeer took off into the air as the bend of the 54th sleigh runner touched the wooden launch pad. The reindeer stomped and snorted, their visible breath filling the air. Jack flicked the reins, and the reindeer began to trot, canter, and gallop up the large wooden ramp, their hoods thudding against the planks until they were off, the sled following them shortly behind. The large circular elven city below was surrounded by an army of lifeless thousands. The meaties, tall skeleton thralls of an elf or human remains, with red tissue still clinging to some areas in their rib cages, not to be confused with the undead that dwelled deep in the Mortis forest. Meaties would come from the deep south once a year and try to penetrate Christmas Town. Whether it be to feast on warm elf meat or something else was unknown to Jack. When he was young and still in school, he heard that expeditions went south to find the origins of meaties. His teachers told him that the explorers came back bearing stories filled with magical tales of endless waterfalls and caves made entirely of sweet desserts. As Jack aged, he learned that the stories were a lie and that the expeditions never did come back. Jack could hear the shouts of elven commanders as they battled the dead below. A flaming trench surrounded the city, ashes billowing into the sky from the hundreds of burning corpses piled atop each other, forming a bridge of bones where the meaty army flooded towards the city walls. As they reached the structure, they began to pile on top of each other, 1, 2, 3, 4, until they looked like ants atop a sugar cube. There were less this year than there were last, way less, though still a sight to behold. Jack, Ronald said in his calm voice, eyes ahead of you, lad. Keep your hands on the reins. The soldiers have their jobs and you have yours. Jack nodded and fixed his gaze ahead of him, where 53 sleighs flew, dumping pails of boiling tar atop the dead army. He heard Jeremy and Kevin chuckle as they did the same. In the corner of his eye, Jack saw Kevin chuck his empty bucket down on the horde, following by Jeremy copying the older elf. Hey, Jeremy, Kevin laughed. Do you think my bucket hit any of them buckers down there? Hope so, Jeremy chuckled. Otherwise, it'd be a waste of a bucket. What about you, Jack? You think we could hit a meaty from here? Kevin asked, the deer master. Jack grinned as he stared ahead. I don't know, he said. Well, it all depends if you injure the fella or not first, Ronald said, not looking up from his maps and paperwork of humans they were going to visit that night. What's the point of irritating a creature with a falling bucket if you don't at least take it out of the fight? Well, of course I injured one, Kevin said. You see, Ronald, a meaty's skull is different from a human skull. It's softer. Ronald, have you ever killed yourself a meaty or just humans? Jeremy asked, or do you just not like fighting the scrawny devils? The navigator smiled and finally looked up from his papers. When I kill things, I like to know they understand they're meeting their end, he said. Jeremy gave an uneasy laugh, and the 5 sat in cold silence. The killing had never been hard for Jack, since all the humans they slaughtered each Christmas Eve had been guilty of treachery, rape, or murder. Though Jack didn't enjoy the way Ronald spoke of it. They continued away from the trenches and the walls of the city and off to the gateway into the outer world, the door. Jack glanced down and saw a few towering bipedal beasts covered in white fur moving along with the dwindling dead army. Ogres. A meaty scurried around it, looking about half the size of the large creature. Jack heard that ogres could smash the walls of Christmas Town into rubble and squash an elf like a bug. which made him glad he didn't have to fight them. He had heard a tale from Ronald that Ross had slayed one before, but the leader had never admitted to it. "Only 30 this year?" Kevin asked. As he looked at the papers, Ronald sheltered with his body. "Yep," Ronald said. 17 nice and 13 naughty. "Who's our big one this year?" Jeremy asked as he took a paper from a safe haven into the ripping wind. "Adrian Benville. That's our big guy this year? Looks like this guy doesn't even have guards." "Lamar. Where's that?" "It's a town near Normandy," Jack said. "We were there 6 years ago, though you weren't with us then." "Hey, do you think I could go with you guys and someone else can stay with the reindeer?" Jeremy asked with hopefulness. "Nope," Ross said, looking down at Ronald's paperwork. "You can go on the big one next year." "You said that last year," Jeremy complained. "I lied last year," Ronald said. "He's just worried for you, son." Kevin patted Jeremy on the shoulder. "You think a middy would be more dangerous than a little noble?" Jeremy scoffed. "I wish," Kevin began, "that I could still distribute coal to the humans who have been exceptionally kind to one another, and all the silencing of humans has really gotten tiring." Ronald gave a small chuckle to Kevin's lie. "Speaking of which," Jack said, "we're halfway to the door, so get prepared for a meaty reunion." The skeleton army beneath them had all but faded away, leaving only footprints and corpses of unlucky animals who got caught in their path. The air became cold and damp as they flew through a large cloud. Jeremy and Kevin each took hold of the large crossbows mounted to the side of the sleigh. Ross strapped on his helmet, while Ronald sat undisturbed, studying his lists and maps. The conversing of elves dwindled. Slowly, one by one, each of the 350 sleds led by Santa fell into a dead silence. The only sound was the soft pants of the reindeer and the light jingle of Christmas bells. In the distance, the faint noise of chattering teeth accompanied the sound of rattling chains. The meaties were near. The first sled of death crashed through the clouds above the right side of Santa's sleigh formation. It was led by 8 thrall reindeer, a bit of blood-soaked flesh still clinging to their bones, and a large black chain links connecting them, unorganized, to a tattered sleigh. The sled was followed by countless others that shared its resemblance. The congregation dove unorganized into the wood and steel of their civilized enemy. While elven sleds struggled to stay in formation, the dead deer crashed into the left side of one of the sleds of Santa's southern flank, sending bones and meat showering down upon the snowy battlefield 100 feet below. Bolts from crossbows began to let loose from all the right-sided elven archers. Kevin pulled the trigger on his crossbow and cursed as his bolt missed its target. Jack just stared ahead, gripping the reins tight in his cramping hands. More and more meaty sled burst from this night, crashing into the elven sleighs. "Grab the damn bow!" Ross shouted at Jeremy, who was aiming his crossbow into a nothingness on the northern flank. The young elf fumbled as he reached into a compartment inside his sled. He took out a bow and quiver, only to drop it in his struggle. The sleigh to their right broke formation and started to dive towards the ground, avoiding a collision with a dead reindeer pulling a broken sled down. Jack shifted his position, giving them more space to maneuver. A sleigh full of meaties then slammed into the side of Sleigh 54. Jack fell, dropping the reins, which he quickly grasped again before their reindeer veered off course. Kevin was able to get one last shot off, catching a meaty in the ribs, forcing it off the sled. "Prepare to be boarded," Ross shouted to his unit. Jeremy scurried to the back of the sled while raining arrows upon the meaty reindeer. Ronald finally looked up from his papers that rustled in the wind before shoving them into a pocket and unsheathing a long, sharp dagger. Ross gripped his sword with clammy hands and prepared to greet the invasion. "Come here, you buggers," Kevin screamed with excitement as he took a hatchet from his belt. Jack still stood hunched like a frightened rabbit as he held the reins, his nose burning from the dead stench. The first meaty was smashed to sharp fragments by Kevin's hatchet. The second swung at Jack with a short, rusty sword, but was deflected by Ross's own blade. In the corner of his eye, Jack saw that bits of red meat on the skeleton seemed to pulse as the creature went to attack Ross. Third meaty gaped as Ronald leaned over the edge of the sleigh and thrust the blade up into its jaw. Jack swore he heard the chatter of the meaty's teeth over the sound of blade on bone. While the melee was in progress, Jeremy had managed to shoot down 3 of the meaty reindeer. The uneven weight of the dead reindeer soon pulled the meaty sled down to the snow. During the scuffle, somehow, a reindeer died, and Sleigh 54 reared off to balance. Jack stared at the limp corpse dangling from its rein. "Hey," Kevin chuckled. "Was that your first meaty, Ronald?" Ronald smiled and opened his mouth to reply, but was cut off by the screams as another enemy sleigh crashed into them, this time smashing into the reindeer. Both dead and living deer struggled, wailing and biting into one another, bones, teeth, and antlers tangled. Meaties began to jump from their sleigh towards Sleigh 54th. Though many could not make the jump and fell into the hungry clouds. With the 2 sleds entwined together, Jack didn't know if it was the meaty's sled diving towards land or his own dead reindeer dragging them to the ground that started the crash. It didn't matter. The white expanse grew closer and bigger. "Prepare to land!" Jack yelled. His heart hammered in his chest as terror overwhelmed him. The sled coming closer and closer to its demise. Jack's eyes watered as the snow-filled wind attacked his face. The elves connected themselves to the sleigh with red straps around their aching shoulders as Jack grasped the reins with all his might, trying to untangle their sleigh from the Meaty's reindeer. The Meaties, who didn't have the luxury of straps or reins to grasp, tumbled off the sled. Jack had gone through this drill plenty of times, but never a real crash. Ronald had been in a crash once 10 years ago. His whole unit died except him. That's when they transferred him to Ross's unit. Jack didn't know how Ronald kept his sanity during the ordeal, and Jack hadn't even crashed the sled yet. He wanted to turn his head to see Ronald's reaction to the chaos, but couldn't force himself to do it. His neck was locked in place. The meaty sled hit the snow, tumbling up and over 100 times, coming to untangled from Jack's sled, only until both sleds collided again. Jack let go of the reins before jumping into the soft, freezing snow. Both sleds came to a stop after flipping and turning in a storm of weapons, coal, and scrap metal in the air. Coughing, Jack stumbled to the wreckage. Bones and dead meaties scattered the ground about him. The screams of dying reindeer pierced the air as Jack passed by a caribou who had snapped free from its harness during the crash, but in doing so caused it to snap its neck and mangle its legs. One of the legs was barely attached above the knee by tendons and muscle. Jack forced himself to look away from the sight and to his comrades who lay injured before him. He found Kevin and Ross struggling to get to their feet. They located Ronald, who had fallen out of his sled halfway through the chaos, somehow uninjured. They finally came upon Jeremy. His breathing heavy, a grin spread across his face. The breaths were too labored, Jack noted, as if Jeremy was trying to suck air from a small tube. There was something wrong with Jeremy. His brown shirt started to grow dark and wet. "Are you okay, Jeremy?" Kevin asked, eyeing the wound. Jeremy looked down to his belly, and the joy melted from his face into the cold snow. He grew pale, as if he had just noticed the wound was there. Jeremy gasped and began to cough. "Oh," was all he could say before he collapsed to the ground. Kevin caught him before he hit the white powder. Jeremy coughed. "You'll be all right, Jeremy," Kevin said with a choke in his voice. "Look at me. You'll be fine." Jeremy coughed again. While he was distracted by Kevin's words, Jack and Ross tore open Jeremy's shirt to reveal a nasty cut. It was uneven. It was an uneven and jagged laceration, though deep. It seemed as if Jeremy moved the wrong way, his guts would all spill out of him like a bloody waterfall. Another cough, a rasp, a smattering of blood. "You'll be all right." Kevin's eyes turned to pools of sorrow. "You'll be all right. You'll be all right. You'll be all right." It was a lie, of course, but before he could comprehend the lie, Jeremy's coughing ended. Kevin's tears warmed the corpse as he was still repeating the words. It was the first time Jack had seen an elf die this close up. 4 years ago, he had witnessed the death of an uncle from old age, but that was not the same. So that's what the inside of me looks like. Jack felt an emptiness and a chill envelop his body. He suddenly became afraid. The meat that Jeremy's gash revealed was darker red than the tissue that clung to Meaty's. It leaked as well. Small trails of blood rolled down Jeremy's stomach like tears that fell from Kevin's eyes. Even when they killed the sinful humans, they made the death as clean and quick as possible. Ross squeezed Jeremy's hand and got up.
We will search the wreckage for supplies, he said, then bury our dead. Jack, Ross, and Ronald searched what was left of Sleigh 54. Jack put a few daggers and a hand mace into a sack along with a quiver of arrows. Jeremy had used and slung the bow around his shoulder. Kevin searched the meaty sleigh. They're all dead, he said, a sadness in his voice replaced with a harsh, stern one. It didn't take them long to dig a hole. They laid the corpse in its new home and buried the young elf in the snow. We need to bury the deer. Jack gazed at the 8 brown bodies that lay strewn and mangled across the red snow. We aren't burying the deer, Ronald replied. We need to bury the deer, Jack repeated, giving no heed to Ronald's words. I said we aren't burying the damn things. Ronald's voice grew loud as he spoke. Now calm it, both of you, Ross interrupted. Ronald's right. We don't have time or energy for that. Let's be thankful we at least got Jeremy in the ground. He then gripped Jack's shoulders with each hand and spoke softer. I know what they mean to you. I know what they mean to us. At home, we may have given them each a funeral, but in these circumstances, we can't. Remember your training. When we make it back, we will mourn, but now we fight. Jack smiled in agreement and forced his eyes away from the animals. What now? Kevin asked, staring at the mound of snow that covered his friend. Jack spoke up. I say we head towards the door. We can wait for passing sleighs there. No, Ronald replied. We need to head to the outpost near the Wailing Mountains. Ronald's right, Ross said. If we go there, it'll be warm, and they'll have food and drinks for us. Plus, there's likely to be meaties at the door waiting for elves to reemerge. Okay, Kevin said. How will we get there? I went there last time, Ronald replied. I know the way. Ross looked at all of them and nodded. They nodded back. And so we're off, he said. Ross and Kevin traded their steel armor for a warmer solution made of fur of rhinus. Ronald kept his leather armor, though grabbed a coat to keep warm. Jack rarely wore armor, so he threw on the same thing everyone else now wore. The group raided the inner compartments of the sled for coal for the humans on the nice list. They gave one last look and left the corpses to be swallowed by the sea of snow. That is just the first portion of Sleigh 54, written by me, Ben. If you want to read the rest of the crew's journey through the snowy wilderness, you can buy the anthology it is in, What Remains, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble's website. What Remains is an anthology full of 15 short stories, mine included, that are equally dark and twisted, but quite diverse in subject matter and material. So if you want to give it a read, not all stories are Christmas. Some are historical, most are fantasy. You can buy it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble's website. I'll leave a link in the description. Thank you.